Philip Barton Key was 40 years old, and he held the office his father had held before him. 5 months after a congressman shot him dead in a public square in daylight, the man who killed him was writing an open letter to a New York newspaper about forgiveness. Key was unarmed when it happened. The letter did not mention him. It ran in the New York Herald in July of 1859, and its subject was a marriage. Daniel Sickles, member of Congress from New York, had taken his wife back into his house, and the country had opinions about it. He wrote that he could see plainly enough in the howl of denunciation that followed her to his threshold the misery and perils from which I have rescued the mother of my child. He had been acquitted of homicide that April. He was writing as a man under attack. He was under attack. The same public that had cheered him out of the courtroom in April turned on him that summer, and it turned over the reconciliation. Killing Philip Barton Key had cost Sickles nothing. Taking his wife back cost him his standing in Washington. He withdrew from public life for a time, though he kept his seat in Congress, and Harper's reported that his powerful friends were disappointed in him. Somewhere underneath that argument, there was a dead man with 4 children, and he had all but disappeared from it. In February, he had been the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia, appointed by a president, confirmed twice by the Senate, nephew of the Chief Justice of the United States, son of the man who wrote the national anthem. By July, he had become a fixed quantity in other people's sentences, the thing that had been done, rather than the person it had been done to. The people who get written out of their own cases are the ones we come back for. Subscribe and you will get the next one. The verdict came on the 26th of April, 1859, 3 months before the letter in the Herald, 20 days after the trial opened. The jury was not out long. One account puts the deliberation at 70 minutes, another at half an hour, and the difference has never been settled. A juryman is said to have asked for time to pray before the voting began. When the foreman said the words "not guilty," the courtroom applauded. Outside, the crowd formed up around the carriage that was taking Daniel Sickles to his hotel and went with it through the streets, singing. The applause had not come out of nowhere, and the record of how it was assembled survives in the trial transcript. Seating a jury had taken 3 days. 230 men were summoned, and one after another they told the court they had already made up their minds. The first man questioned said he had formed his opinion on rumor alone, and that if the facts turned out otherwise, he could not judge them fairly. His mind, he said, was biased in favor of the prisoner. Another had gone so far as to say that Sickles was justified in shooting Mr. Key. Others were strongly biased, or strongly sympathetic, or would acquit the man outright if they were seated. None of them had yet heard the words temporary insanity, because the defense had not raised them. They were deciding on the plain facts, which nobody disputed. 12 men were eventually found. Within the week, a play about the case opened in Boston under the title Sickles, or the Washington Tragedy. The Boston Ledger called it a very close and correct dramatization from the facts, and thought it carried a good moral. The trial had opened on the 4th of April, and it was not, in any ordinary sense, a contest. On one side stood 7 or 8 of the leading lawyers in the country, several of them among the best-known men at the American bar, working for Daniel Sickles without fee. One of them, Edwin Stanton, would be Secretary of War under Lincoln inside 3 years. Against them, the government sent a young assistant of the dead prosecutor, Robert Ould, who had inherited the case along with his superior's unfinished business. While that case was being prepared, the defendant was receiving congressmen and senators in the head jailer's apartment at the Washington jail, which had been turned over to him for the purpose. The President of the United States sent him a personal note. John Graham opened for the defense and spoke for 2 days. His argument moved through Othello, through Judaic history, through Roman law, and it was printed afterward as a book. He told the jury they were there to fix the price of the marriage bed. He asked whether it was any use punishing a man for what he could not help doing. The state of mind he described had not carried a name in an American courtroom before, and the name the defense gave it was temporary insanity. James Brady closed on older ground, telling the jury that the law offered a man nothing when his household was invaded. Robert Walker, who had been Secretary of the Treasury under Polk, testified about the state of his old friend on the day of the shooting, describing sounds he called an agony of unnatural and unearthly noise. Partway through that testimony, Sickles broke down. 3 men, one of them his father, helped him from the room, and some of the jurors were seen crying. Auld told the jury a plainer story. His client had put on a heavy overcoat on a warm afternoon, had filled its pockets with pistols, and had walked out to a square in front of the White House to do what he had told a friend beforehand he intended to do. A man in that condition, Auld said, had come to that carnival of blood fully prepared. He called Sickles a walking magazine of firearms. Then he set out the point the defense would spend 20 days trying to bury. Key had been unarmed and defenseless, and a killing done by a man who holds every advantage in circumstances showing cruelty is murder, whatever the provocation behind it. The indictment had already put a price on the weapon, a certain pistol of the value of $2. The man they were arguing about had been 40 years old. His wife Ellen had died some years before, and he had been bringing up 4 children on his own. The office he held had been his father's before him, and the Senate had confirmed him in it twice. On the 27th of February, he had stood in a public square with nothing in his hands, had asked what for, and had asked not to be killed. He had been dead 5 weeks by the time the arguments began. The most widely read document in the case was one the judge had ruled the jury could not hear. Teresa Sickles had written it in February, in her own house, at her husband's demand after he put in front of her what an anonymous letter had told him. She described the house on 15th Street and the room upstairs. She signed it with her maiden name, Teresa Baggioli. The document was fought over for 4 days of the trial. The defense wanted the affair in evidence to explain the frenzy. The prosecution called the confession hearsay, and on the 13th day, the judge ruled the evidence of the affair admissible. The reporter in the room wrote that the silence while the ruling was read was almost painful. 2 days later, the defense rested without ever putting the confession in. Auld stood up and offered them the chance to introduce it anyway. They declined. It reached the country regardless. The text was leaked, and the newspapers printed it in full, and what a jury of 12 never saw was read that spring by a nation. She was 22. Her father was a well-known Italian singing master in New York. Her grandfather had written librettos for Mozart, and she had spoken 5 languages before she was grown. In Washington, she had been called the Queen of the city's society, at home to callers on Tuesday mornings, hostess of a formal dinner every Thursday. Her daughter Laura was 6 years old that February. On the day of the shooting, her husband had stopped at the house on his way to the jail. He took away her wedding ring, accepted when she was 15 or 16, along with the diamond earrings he had given her on their wedding night. Her clergyman went to him and asked for the ring. She got the ring back. She was never charged with anything because there was nothing to charge her with. She had no lawyers, and nobody offered to represent her without fee. She gave no testimony because no proceeding existed in which she could have given any. The Wilmington Journal saw the shape of it that April. While the husband was the man on trial, the paper wrote, "His wife has really been the person tied, condemned, and executed." In California, meanwhile, the state was prosecuting the Daily Evening Bulletin for obscenity for having printed what she wrote. In the first days of March, in print, the city began working out what to make of the man who had been killed. On the 12th, Harper's told its readers that the public of the United States would justify a man who killed the one who had dishonored his bed. The New York Times came out for Sickles and attacked the Tribune for condemning the killing. Across the country, the papers arrived at a formula that held for the rest of the spring. The congressman had done Washington a service, and the women of the Capitol were safer for it. Both of the great illustrated weeklies ran images of the prisoner. Harper's printed an engraving of him in his cell, a haggard man with his hands clasped as if in prayer, the light falling on his face, and the wall behind him, the rest of the cell in shadow. The same magazine printed an editorial some weeks later, complaining about the campaign of sympathy being built around the congressman. That campaign had been carried in good part on its own presses. The record of the man being defended in those columns did not appear in them. The New York State Assembly had censured him for bringing a well-known prostitute onto the floor of the chamber, and the same woman went with him to England, where he presented her at court under a borrowed surname. His marriage to Teresa Bagioli had been made over the objection of both families when she was 15 or 16, and he was in his 30s. He kept mistresses throughout it. Something else did not appear in them either. The household left behind, the widower with 4 children in his care, was not in a single column that spring. The papers had the name, the office, the father who wrote the anthem, and the affair. Key's uncle, Roger Taney, was sitting as Chief Justice of the United States while they explained what kind of man his nephew had been. Of the 4 children, the material records the name of one son and nothing at all about the other 3. One documented affair belonging to a dead man reached the whole country in March. His 4 children reached nobody. Early in the afternoon of the 27th of February, Daniel Sickles put his pistol away in his coat pocket and walked out of Lafayette Square. Lying on the ground near the place where Key had fallen was a pair of opera glasses. He picked those up and put them in the same pocket. He walked a few blocks to Franklin Square to the house of the Attorney General of the United States, Jeremiah Black, and told him what he had done. 2 policemen came for him there, and he went with them without argument. On the way to the jail, he asked to stop at his own house. He came out of it carrying his wife's wedding ring and a pair of diamond earrings. Behind him, men were carrying Philip Barton Key out of the square and into a house nearby. He was unconscious when they moved him. He died there about an hour later. Half an hour before any of that, Philip Barton Key walked into Lafayette Square, took out a handkerchief, and waved it toward the windows of the house across the way. He had given that signal many times. It belonged to an arrangement of long standing between himself and Teresa Sickles, and to a set of small practical habits the 2 of them had built up over the previous year. There was a rented house on 15th Street, between K and L, in a poor part of town. When he was inside, he hung a string out of the window and left the door unfastened, and she walked in. The neighbors had noticed the string. Key did not know that 3 days earlier his name had been written into a confession in the hand of the woman he was signaling to. He did not know the letter had come at all. He waved the handkerchief at a second-floor window in the ordinary way, expecting the ordinary answer, and the man who came out of the house was her husband. Sickles had seen the signal from inside. He put on a heavy overcoat, loaded several pistols into its pockets, and crossed into the square. Key was not alone. Samuel Butterworth, an acquaintance of Sickles, had been standing with him and talking with him in the minutes before, and Butterworth was a few feet away for all of what followed. What was said in the next moments comes down to us from the men who were close enough to hear it, and their versions differ in a word. Sickles said good morning. Key answered, asking how he was. Then Sickles told him he had dishonored his house and that he must die, calling him either a scoundrel or a villain, depending on which account is followed. Key asked, "What for?" He was carrying nothing. He had come out to wave a handkerchief at a window, and the only object on him was the pair of opera glasses he used to watch that window from the club across the street. The first shot missed him, or grazed his hand. Key went at Sickles and got hold of his coat, and the two of them struggled there in the open with Butterworth standing where he was. In the struggle, a derringer came out of Sickles's hand and fell to the ground, where it stayed. Sickles pulled free and drew a second pistol out of the overcoat. Key threw the opera glasses at him. They were what he had. He was hit, and he went down, and as he tried to get away from Sickles, he called out not to be shot, and then called murder. Further shots were fired at close range. The accounts differ on how many. When it was over, with Key lying on the ground, more than one witness heard Sickles standing over him and saying that he had violated his bed. Lafayette Square on a Sunday afternoon was a public thoroughfare with the president's house in view across the road. There were men within a few yards of both of them. It was finished inside a minute. Sickles stood off. Bystanders reached Key where he lay, and he did not speak again. The derringer was still on the ground where it had fallen, a few feet from both of them. The letter had come on the evening of Thursday, the 24th of February, by most accounts 3 days before. Nobody has ever established who wrote it. It arrived at the house among his other papers, as a party there was breaking up. It was detailed and it was accurate. It gave Key's name and his office, named the street and the block, and named the man the house was rented from, John Gray. It described the string in the window and the door left unfastened. Having laid all that out, the writer told Sickles he would leave the rest to him to imagine. A facsimile was reproduced in Harper's later that year. Sickles did not act on it that evening. He sent a man he trusted to watch the house on 15th Street. The man came back and reported what he had seen. A woman answering her description, going in by the rear door. A man answering Key's going in by the front. The two of them inside for about an hour. Only then did Sickles go to his wife. She denied it. He put the details in front of her, the ones from the letter and the ones his man had brought back, and she stopped denying it. By the end of that day, the confession existed. That was Saturday. On Sunday, Philip Barton Key came into the square with his handkerchief. The affair had begun in the spring of 1858, and by the following winter, it was one of the more widely known facts in Washington. The Sickles household had been at the center of the city's political society since 1857. There were formal dinners every Thursday. Teresa was at home to callers on Tuesday mornings, and Harper's Weekly told its readers that she had become a fixture of the capital almost as soon as she arrived. Her husband's work and his other interests kept him away a great deal. Philip Barton Key, a widower, a friend of the house, and by common report the handsomest man in Washington, went with her to the parties and the theater and the receptions when Sickles did not. That arrangement was ordinary enough to begin with. It stopped being ordinary in the spring of 1858, and the city understood what it was looking at almost at once. The Hartford Courant, writing the day after the shooting, described rumors of improper intimacy that had been floating about for more than a year. The talk was general. It reached the drawing rooms, the newspaper correspondents, the households of both families. It did not reach the one man it concerned most, or reached him and was refused. He had accused her of unfaithfulness before, more than once in 5 years of marriage, and she had denied it, and he had let the denials stand. While that year went by, Key kept up an arrangement of his own. There was a club across the street from the Sickles house, and from a window in it, a man could see the second floor of the house opposite. By one account, he would sit there with a pair of opera glasses and watch for her to appear at that window, which was the signal that he could come over. The glasses had been made for looking at a stage from a distance in a crowded room. He used them for a year to watch a window across a street. On the last afternoon of his life, he had them with him in the square, and they were the only thing he had to throw. Some years afterward, at a theater in New York, Daniel Sickles became aware that James Key was sitting in the audience. James Key was the son of the man he had shot. The two of them watched each other through the performance. Nothing happened. Neither man approached the other, and that evening survives in a single late retelling the whole of the record of it. Sickles lived another 55 years. He went into the war and lost a leg at Gettysburg, served as minister to Spain, sat in Congress again, and was given the Medal of Honor 34 years after the battle. Working to preserve the Gettysburg battlefield, he obtained the old iron fencing from Lafayette Square and had it carried up to mark out the borders of the park. He was 94 when he died, in May of 1914, and the funeral procession went up Fifth Avenue to St. Patrick's, with men taking off their hats along the route. His obituary in the New York Times disposed of the whole matter in one sentence. Philip Barton Key had paid attention to Mrs. Sickles, the paper said, and Sickles had shot and killed him in Washington. Teresa Sickles died of tuberculosis on the 5th of February, 1867, at 31. The church at her funeral was full. Laura, who had been 6 years old in the February of the shooting, died in 1891 at 38. Philip Barton Key was 40. He is buried at Oak Hill Cemetery, in the city where he had been the government's attorney.